So I just want to thank everybody for joining this afternoon session on protest and controversy in New Jersey political history. So something that's very much been in the news in our contemporary world, but we're going to be getting some great historical perspectives on these issues. I am Dr. Lucia McMahon. I am your moderator for this panel. As I said, this panel is being recorded, so just so you're aware of that. The protocol has been, as I mentioned, for listeners to keep their mics and cameras off during the presentations. If you'd like to put any questions into the chat or the question and answer box, feel free to do that at any time. I just want to very briefly, since I am the moderator, take a very quick moment, especially because I see Pete Michele here with us from New Jersey History, to let you know that I am one of the new co-editors of an exciting new series put out by Rutgers University Press, hot off the presses, so to speak. And this is a series called Series, actually, featuring New Jersey Rutgers Studies in History, hoping to highlight New Jersey history, regional history more broadly. So if you are interested, please, reach out to us, and hope to be able to work with you if you are thinking about book projects. So I just wanted to give a plug for that, and I can answer any questions about that after the panel. I don't want to take up too much of the time that's devoted to our presenters, but wanted to give a brief shout out on that. So I'm going to go in the order of the papers that are listed. So our first presenter will be Ron Becker, who is professor of Emeritus, at Rutgers University Libraries, where he served for over 45 years, including 25 years as the head of special collections and university archives at the library. So any of us who have worked on New Jersey history have probably spent time with Ron in his role there. And he has also been, as most of you should know, a very active member of this New Jersey history community for decades, right? He currently has retired and is living in Florida, where he is the spiritual leader of the Jewish Community Center in West Pasco, and also, maintaining his lifelong love of libraries, is on the boards of the Newport Richey Public Library and the Pasco County Library System. So Ron, you want to get us started and introduce our two other speakers who are actually giving a paper together. So you get a special treat here. Our first of these two co-speakers is Phillip Pappas, who is a senior professor of history at Union County College. He earned bachelor's and master's degrees in history from Hunter College, CUNY, and advanced degrees, including his PhD in history from the Graduate Center of the City University of New York. He's the author of several publications, including That Ever Loyal Island, Staten Island and the American Revolution, Renegade Revolutionary, The Life of General Charles Lee, and he is also co-author of Port Richmond, and he has been featured in the documentary film Loyalty and Rebellion. And he is currently writing about World War I from the perspective of local history. He is joined for this talk by his colleague Michele Rotunda, who is an assistant professor of history at Union County College. She earned her master's in history from the Rutgers Newark NJIT Federated Program and her PhD in history from Rutgers University, so shout out to Rutgers there. She is the author of A Drunkard's Defense, Alcohol, Murder, and Medical Jurisprudence in 19th Century America, which sounds fascinating, and is forthcoming in February of early next year. She has written and presented on her own family's Italian-American history during World War II, and is currently working on a short history of Italian-Americans in New Jersey. So we're gonna take it away to them, and hopefully in the 20 or 25 minutes they have, we can get Ron squared away. So, so thanks so much.
Okay, just give me a second to get the PowerPoint here. Okay. All right, and that's working, I'm gonna assume. I don't have the, I don't know where the chat went.
Yep.
Okay, thank you. Okay, well, thank you everyone for logging in this afternoon. Let's see, so Joseph Thomas Angelo was born February 16th, 1896 in Latimer, a coal mining town in Luzerne County in eastern Pennsylvania. His father, Anthony, was an Italian immigrant who came to the United States in 1879 when he was 8, and he eventually married Edith, whose family had roots in New Jersey. By 1902, the Angelo family had moved to Camden, New Jersey. Camden at the time was home to a variety of industries, including the Campbell Soup Company, the New York Shipbuilding Corporation, and RCA Victor, that drew a large immigrant population. The majority were Italian and Eastern European immigrants who served as a source of cheap labor. Anthony Angelo, his father, worked as a switchman for the Public Service Corporation, and his wife Edith took care of the home. The Angelo family lived in rented homes and eventually settled in a row house on Carmen Avenue in the 12th Ward in East Camden. This was a heavily immigrant working class neighborhood. Joseph likely attended local public schools. He did recount he spent a year in reform school, and by 1915 he worked as a laborer. By the time he was 21, Joseph Angelo had relocated to Penns Grove, New Jersey, about 28 miles south of Camden, and found a job at the DuPont Powder Works in nearby Carneys Point. By this time, war had broken out in Europe, the summer of 1914, and the DuPont company, like many other companies, saw its profits grow. They manufactured gunpowder and explosives to supply the Allied armies. At Carneys Point, DuPont had expanded to almost 70 times its pre-war capacity and increased their labor force by 25,000 workers. Angelo was earning $1.25 an hour working there, a very good wage at the time. But in December 1917, he enlisted in the US Army with 3 of his coworkers. Apparently, they were following through on a challenge after they were called yellow. Angelo was sent for basic training to Camp Dix and was assigned to the 2nd Company Provisional Recruit Battalion. On January 23rd, 1918, he sailed for France from Hoboken, New Jersey, aboard the USS Huron.
Welcome, everybody. In France, Angelo volunteered for the recently created Tank Corps. Georges Patton Jr., who had been trained as a cavalryman, was a captain at the time serving in Pershing's staff. Unhappy with his current assignment, Patton was eager to move on to something more challenging and exciting, and so he applied for the Tank Corps and was accepted. Patton commanded the 1st American Tank Brigade, the 304th Tank Brigade. After joining the Tank Corps, Private Joseph T. Angelo was assigned to the headquarters company of the 304th, where he became Patton's orderly or his aide. Angelo came to respect Patton and to admire his courage. The Meuse-Argonne offensive began on September 26, 1918. Patton had devised a plan for a concentrated armored assault against the German lines. Quote, "We went over the top at 6:30 in the morning," remembered Angelo. They headed towards the town of Cheppy, and after a few miles met up with some American tanks at a crossroads. Almost immediately, German artillery shells landed nearby, followed by rapid machine gun fire. Patton went ahead on foot to survey the area. He then directed his men, including Angelo, to move forward. German machine gun fire caused the Americans to hit the ground after only 50 yards. Patton instructed Angelo to take 15 men and wipe out that machine gun nest. But they found maneuvering toward the enemy daunting. Angelo alone returned to find Patton still taking cover on the ground and reported that except for himself, all the men sent to dislodge the machine gunners had been killed. When I told him the infantrymen had been killed by the machine guns, he ordered me to accompany him, Angelo remembered, declaring he would clear them out. Patton picked himself up, waved his walking stick in the air, and shouted to the men who were still with him, "Let's go, let's go." Angelo wondered whether the colonel had gone mad during the chaos of battle. As they raced toward the enemy, German machine gun fire intensified. "We went about 30 yards and the colonel fell with a bullet in his thigh," Angelo explained. The shock and pain of the bullet, which exited Patton's body 2 inches from his rectum, left him unconscious and unable to move. Angelo dragged him into a shell hole, cut his trousers, and bandaged his wounds. Patton regained consciousness after 2 hours, and after a pause in the fighting, Angelo found 4 soldiers to help place the officer, still conscious but suffering from heavy loss of blood, on a stretcher and carry him to a medic tent at the rear of the lines. Patton was immediately sent for surgery. He awoke the next morning dazed, but otherwise feeling well. The armistice of November 11, 1918, effectively ended fighting in World War I. Patton remained in France with the 304th Tank Brigade until March 2, 1919, when the unit, including the man who had saved his life, Private Joseph T. Angelo, boarded the SS Patriot at the French port of Marseille and bound for the United States. The ship arrived in a fog-draped New York harbor to great fanfare on St. Patrick's Day, 1919. In an interview, Patton praised Angelo as the bravest man I know. I owe him my life, and he saved the entire tank brigade. Patton had recommended Angelo for the Distinguished Service Cross, which he was awarded on December 17, 1918, and asked him to continue to serve as his aide. Angelo gave the offer serious consideration before refusing it. I wish I had stayed on in the Army, he recalled later. I wanted to come home. Angelo returned to Camden a local hero. In addition to the Distinguished Service Cross, he had been awarded the French War Medal and the French Croix de Guerre. Headlines from across the United States acknowledged his heroism. Angelo was described as, quote, the Italian soldier and the Jersey boy, who earned the title, quote, the bravest man in the U.S. Army. He spoke to audiences at churches and at meetings of civic organizations across Camden, regaling them with stories of his heroic actions. As one local newspaper put it, Angelo was, quote, Camden's own Sergeant York, a reference to Sergeant Alvin C. York of the 82nd Division, who was awarded the Medal of Honor and became a national hero for saving his platoon by single-handedly taking on a German machine gun unit, killing 25 enemy soldiers and capturing another 132.
Despite this notoriety, Angelo had trouble readjusting to civilian life. While he was overseas, his mother Edith had died of influenza in October 1918. Less than a year later, his father married a neighbor, Esther Bilby Jobs, a widow with 2 children. Her husband had also died of influenza around the same time as Edith. Joseph's relationship with his father had also been strained. He said, quote, I got a wonderful send-off when I went to France. My father threw me out. It wasn't until he returned from war that he learned of his father's remarriage to a woman he didn't think much of. Apparently it was mutual, and Joseph was kicked out of the house shortly after. Angelo tried but failed to gain a job with the Camden Fire Department. He said they rejected him because he was too light. He only weighed about 107 pounds. So he eventually found employment at one of the city's shipyards. He joined the Veterans of Foreign War, and in November 1922 married Sarah Force, who was from Camden's 12th Ward. Their only child, Betty, was born October 1923, and they moved to the Delaware section of Pennsauken, a few miles from East Camden. Joseph Angelo worked as a car repairman for a local railroad, but he lost his job, like many other veterans, at the start of the Great Depression. By 1931, Angelo was back in the spotlight as part of the struggle by veterans of the First World War to receive cash payment at face value of the bonuses they'd been promised for their service. After the war, nearly 4 million American soldiers returned home and found that civilian workers had enjoyed substantial pay raises while their wages were only $1 per day. Veterans advocates demanded that these men be compensated for their financial sacrifice. So in 1924, Congress passed the World War Adjusted Compensation Bill, or Soldiers' Bonus Bill, which called for compensation of $1.25 for each day a veteran served overseas and $1 for each day served stateside. Anyone owed $50 or less would be paid immediately. The others were given a certificate that would collect 4% interest with an additional 25% upon payment. However, it was dubbed the tombstone bonus, since it was not payable until 1945 or to a veteran's dependents upon his death. In January 1931, Representative Wright Patman of Texas reintroduced a bill he'd first proposed in May 1929 for the immediate payment of the wartime bonus. A week before the scheduled hearings on the bill before the House Ways and Means Committee, Patman addressed a delegation of roughly 1,000 VFW-affiliated veterans, the so-called cash bonus pilgrims, who had traveled to Washington, D.C. They had marched along Pennsylvania Avenue demanding immediate payment of their bonuses. They were met here, as you can see, on the steps of the Capitol building by Patman and several other representatives who supported the immediate payment. Patman characterized the bonus as payment of an honest debt. Secretary of the Treasury, financier and industrialist Andrew Mellon opposed the bill and testified the veterans were a class not in particular need, and providing the bonus would be, quote, a serious impediment to business recovery. Testimony included not just Mellon, but numerous wealthy corporate executives, bankers, as well as representatives from the American Legion and VFW. But perhaps the most compelling testimony came from Joseph T. Angelo. He had walked 160 miles to Washington with another veteran, George Kint, a former Marine from Darby, Pennsylvania. I'd done it all by my feet, shoe leather, he said. He represented the Corporal Matthews Purnell Post, number 518, VFW of Camden, and presented a petition signed by 1,800 Camden veterans. He explained to the committee that he owed taxes on the Delaware home he built by himself. And here's sort of a picture recently, thanks to Zillow, that I found the house on. And he said, now I expect to lose that little place. The $4 in local public assistance he received was not enough to save his house and take care of his family. And he didn't understand how he could be in debt and hungry while holding a certificate that was valued at over $1,400. Representative James Freer, Wisconsin Republican, asked him what was his business. Angelo responded, "Nothing. I'm nothing but a bum now." He explained he'd not worked for a year and a half. His statements, however, stood in stark contrast to the story of battlefield heroism Angelo presented to the committee. He proudly showed them the Distinguished Service Cross that hung from his jacket. The committee members were duly impressed as Angelo recounted saving the life of his commander, Colonel George S. Patton Jr., claiming he killed 4 Germans in the process. He then displayed a Tiffany gold watch he had received from Mrs. George S. Patton Jr. in grateful remembrance, and a gold bullet stick pin with a pearl given to him by the colonel's mother. Representative Henry Rainey, a Democrat from Illinois, called Joseph's retelling of his wartime experiences the best speech I have heard yet. Angelo was careful not to appear as though he was asking for anything he didn't deserve. The men he represented, he assured them, didn't go to war, quote, for money. We went in there for our country, for our flag, and we fought for it. We slept in the mud, we ate when we got it, and when we didn't get it, we didn't kick. Angelo explained he left a job making $1.25 an hour for one that paid only $1 a day, and he was proud to have done it. However, he also compared himself to those who didn't join the military and remained stateside, like his brothers-in-law, who, quote, were making big money. He said the veterans had not had a square deal. Congress, however, did not pass the Patman bill, but rather a compromise measure sponsored by Representative Isaac Becker, a Republican who represented New Jersey's 2nd congressional district, which included Atlantic City. The emergency adjusted compensation bill increased the amount veterans could borrow against their certificates from the original 22.5% to 50% of the face value at 4.5% compounded interest. The bonus loan gained momentum in Congress after it was endorsed by the American Legion. Despite passing overwhelmingly in the House and Senate on February 12, 1931, the bill was vetoed by President Hoover 2 weeks later. Hoover rejected the bill with damning praise for the veterans. He said, "The patriotism of our people is not a material thing. It is a spiritual thing. We cannot pay for it with government aid." He concluded the bill impeded the nation's economic recovery and set a dangerous precedent of government reliance over self-reliance and self-support. Congress overrode Hoover's veto, and many veterans quickly took advantage of the new bonus loans. However, this compromise did not satisfy Representative Patman and the many others, including Joseph T. Angelo, who had supported immediate cash payment.
During the early months of 1932, the bonus continued to be a topic of much discussion on Capitol Hill and among veterans organizations. Representative Patman introduced a new version of his bill, calling for the full and immediate cash payment of the bonus. By the spring of 1932, disgruntled, broke, and unemployed veterans like Joseph Angelo continued to demand immediate payment. But many members of Congress and President Hoover remain opposed to this idea, arguing that it would place a severe strain on the federal budget. Across the United States, veterans made plans to march on Washington, D.C. to voice their discontent and press their demands for immediate payment. The idea for a march on Washington originated with Walter W. Waters, an unemployed veteran from Portland, Oregon. Throughout the spring of 1932, an estimated 20,000 veterans, black and white, arrived in D.C., many of them with their families. They settled in parks and abandoned government buildings. The superintendent of the D.C. Police Department, Pelham D. Glassford, who had been the youngest brigadier general in the U.S. Army during World War I, understood the gravity of the situation and quickly arranged to house the veterans in an encampment on the Anacostia Flats on the west side of the Anacostia River that could be reached from Capitol Hill only by a wooden drawbridge. Although Glassford provided the veterans some building materials, they made do with what they could find in nearby junk piles and local scrap yards. Tents, lean-tos, and shacks made of old lumber, packing boxes, thatched straw, and scrap tins sprang up almost overnight in makeshift encampments that during an era of Jim Crow were integrated. The encampments, the largest of which was Camp Marks, were designed as self-contained communities with streets, sanitation facilities, social gathering spots, celebrations and parades, law enforcement, and their own newspaper, the BEF News. But in the encampments, the circumstances were precarious. Despite some financial assistance from the VFW, donations from supporters, and offers of assistance from the local police force. Joseph T. Angelo was one of the leaders and a key spokesperson for the bonus marchers from Camden. His notoriety for saving Patton and the visibility of his Distinguished Service Cross lent the movement credibility, and he was held up as one of the war heroes whose record and experiences were an example of the need for the bonus. The presence of veterans like Angelo, who had earned the Distinguished Service Cross, also presented a counter to a narrative that had gained traction nationwide, linking the bonus marchers to a communist agenda. U.S. military intelligence reports indicated the Communist Party had influence over the veterans and was determined to overthrow the government. The press sensationalized the story, focusing on a small communist faction organized by the Workers' Ex-Servicemen's League among the ranks of the bonus marchers. On June 15th, the House took up the Patman bill, which passed by a vote of 209 to 176. But on June 17th, after 7 hours of debate, the Senate, concerned about running a federal deficit, rejected the bill by a vote of 62 to 18. After hearing the news of the bill's defeat, disappointed bonus marchers began to gather their belongings and make preparations to return home. But even with this stinging defeat in the Senate, thousands of bonus marchers stayed in the nation's capital. They refused to accept the vote as the final word on the matter. Among them was Joseph Angelo. By early July, government officials feared that the bitterness felt by the remaining veterans of the defeat of the bonus bill and deteriorating conditions in their encampments would lead to widespread violence. A particular concern were nearly 1,500 veterans who were occupying a group of abandoned Treasury Department buildings and lots between Pennsylvania and Missouri avenues near the Capitol. The D.C. Board of Commissioners, on the authority of the Treasury Department, ordered the police to evict the veterans from the buildings. Adding to the fears of violence were the rumors related to communist influence that was circulating around the city. While the leaders of the bonus army maintained that any communists within their ranks were an ineffectual minority, government and media reports continued to focus on the communist influence in the bonus army, raising public suspicions. The U.S. Army Chief of Staff, General Douglas MacArthur, was among those in the government who publicly associated the bonus marchers with the threat of communism. MacArthur was convinced that the bonus army had been infiltrated by communists who hoped to incite revolutionary action. Even President Hoover was convinced that many of the bonus seekers had stayed on after Congress had adjourned were communists and persons with criminal records. On July 28, 1932, several D.C. police officers successfully evicted veterans encamped in one of the abandoned Treasury Department buildings, a former National Guard armory. Police cordoned off the area around the building as several bonus marchers converged on the scene, rushing the police lines and seizing a large pile of bricks, which they proceeded to throw at the officers who moved towards them in the phalanx, eventually quelling the situation. The scene remained peaceful until 1:45 p.m. when police were sent to break up a fight between two groups of bonus marchers in a building right near the former armory. Shots were fired during clashes that ensued, leaving 3 officers injured, 1 veteran dead, and another mortally wounded. The latest confrontation between the police and protesters led President Hoover to direct General MacArthur to deploy Army units from nearby bases to support the local police to evict the veterans from the abandoned buildings and to restore order. MacArthur was to drive the veterans from the downtown area across the Anacostia drawbridge to Camp Marks, but the troops were not to pursue them any further. At 4:30 p.m., nearly 200 mounted cavalry, led by a commanding officer, Major George S. Patton Jr., the man Angelo had saved in the Argonne, rode towards the veterans with their sabers drawn. They were followed by 5 tanks and roughly 400 infantrymen, wearing gas masks and carrying loaded rifles and fixed bayonets. The cavalry and tanks drove members of the bonus army, many with their wives and children, down Pennsylvania Avenue as the infantry tossed tear gas grenades at the fleeing crowds. The makeshift shelters and lean-tos that the veterans had constructed near the armory were torched by soldiers with flamethrowers. After 2 hours, the troops had driven 2,000 bonus marchers from the downtown area across the Anacostia drawbridge. Ignoring President Hoover's directive, however, MacArthur ordered his men across the bridge to evict the veterans from Camp Marks. The veterans were shocked at the sight of U.S. soldiers going, quote, into action against them and began to evacuate the encampment. Okay. MacArthur ordered his troops bivouacked on the grounds and declared the day is over. 2 veterans were dead, and an 11-month-old child lost its life due to gas-related illness. An 8-year-old boy was partially blinded by tear gas. 2 officers suffered skull fractures, and thousands of bonus marchers endured gas-related injuries. Major Dwight David Eisenhower, MacArthur's principal aide, conceded that radical elements might have misled some of the bonus marchers, but dismissed MacArthur as a damn fool for the actions he authorized his troops to take against them. Many of the bonus marchers departed from Washington while others wandered listlessly in search of new quarters. One of those veterans who roamed aimlessly among the smoldering cardboard and wooden shanties was Joseph Angelo. Dazed and suffering from smoke inhalation, Angelo came upon a sergeant from the 12th Infantry Regiment and asked to speak with the man whose life he had saved during the Great War, Major Georges Patton Jr. The sergeant obliged and led Angelo to an area that had once been part of Camp Marks. There, Patton and several other officers were standing in front of a field kitchen drinking their morning coffees. The sergeant approached Patton and informed him that he was with one of the bonus marchers who claimed he knew him. When Angelo came forward, Patton stared at the slender veteran and declared, "Sergeant, I do not know this man. Take him away, and under no circumstances permit him to return." As the sergeant led a stunned Angelo away, Patton, concerned with his reputation, said to the other officers, "That man was my orderly during the war. When I was wounded, he dragged me into a shell hole on the fire. I got him a decoration for it. Since the war, my mother and I have more than supported him. Can you imagine the headlines if the papers got wind of our meeting here this morning? Of course, we'll take care of him anyway." Because of the injuries he had sustained, Angelo was taken to Walter Reed Hospital. After his release from the hospital, Angelo made his way back home to Camden, New Jersey, and to the Great Depression.
I can't see the chat. I'm going to assume I'm okay with 2 more minutes. I wasn't sure if you're wanting. Okay, good. Angelo continued to struggle after his participation in the Bonus Army. He found temporary employment with the WPA in Camden, but was unable to find steady work. In April of 1942, he wrote President Roosevelt directly, complaining he'd been unable to get a job. He said, "I have applications on file with the New York Shipbuilding Company for a job as a pipe fitter's helper, but I don't hear from them. They have me on the sidelines." Angelo's plea made the local news, where he was identified as the winner of the Distinguished Service Cross in the French Croix de Guerre, as well as a man who, when he starts out to get a job, he doesn't fool around. Angelo registered for the draft again in 1942, but at the age of 46, he was not called to serve. He eventually found employment at RCA as a painter and continued to live with his family in Del Air. Over the years, the story of Joseph T. Angelo, the bravest man in America, appeared and reappeared in human interest stories. Angelo was invited to comment on a film made about Patton in 1970. He appeared in a World War II comic book and was honored by Nixon for his 76th birthday. Angelo's story is interesting as we consider the relationship, especially today, between patriotism and protest. For the men of the Bonus Army, veterans of World War I, protest was, as General Smedley Butler declared, a demonstration of pure Americanism. But for many like Angelo, protest was justified by his service, by an indisputable patriotism. Joseph Angelo was interviewed frequently over the intervening years and recounted his story of heroism and proudly displayed the medal and the watch he received from Beatrice Patton. When asked, he expressed support for the war in Vietnam and condemned the youthful protests of the 1970s. In the end, it was as a soldier that he defined himself.
Hi, thank you so much, Michele and Phillip. And apologize for the earlier technical glitches, but I believe we now have Ron Becker back with us. So hopefully Ron is here to give his presentation now. Ron, you with us?
I'm here. I hope you can all hear me and see me, because at this point now I can't see you. But as long as you can hear me and see me, this is great. Zoom has its ups and its downs. Without Zoom, I wouldn't be able to participate in conferences that are over 1,000 miles away and be connected with the community that with all my dear colleagues. And I thank you all for your tolerance. So just let me you can all hear me, right? Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you, Ron.
Yes,
Great.
we're good.
Hear you.
We're good, Ron.
Okay. So we're gonna, the timing of this could not be any better. In this hotly contested election season, it's difficult to imagine any scenarios that would be more trying to our nation than that we have here in 2020 with this contested election. However, the 2020 presidential and congressional election is almost timid compared to some of the earlier battles facing the nation. New Jersey was certainly not spared from the consequences of accusations of voter fraud resulting in complete chaos, mistrust of its governor and council, and finally, in the state's loss of its representation in the U.S. House of Representatives, at a time when the rancorous House was probably as evenly divided among Democrats and Whigs, and nearly every issue was hotly contested. So very, very much like it is today, a completely divided House with an election that just doesn't seem to go very well. And New Jersey is the epicenter of that problem back in 1838. Only the US House was affected at the time because the Senate was still appointed by the state legislatures. It wasn't until the 17th Amendment, enacted in 1913, that established direct election of senators by people. So the US House is elected by the people, but in New Jersey, it's a little bit different than it is now. New Jersey elected its congressional delegation totally at large. Today, of course, we have congressional districts. So if something gets fouled up, it gets fouled up in that district. But all 6 of New Jersey's representatives to the US House of Representatives at that time were elected at large by all the voters that were eligible to vote in New Jersey. So to set the stage of this ugly situation in 1838, the US House was split almost exactly in half, with Democrats holding a very slim 1-vote majority over the Whigs, 119 to 118, not counting the representatives from New Jersey. Elections to the US House of Representatives for the 26th Congress were held during President Martin Van Buren's term at various dates in 1838, from July through November. New Jersey's election was in October. At the time, party platforms were still not the norm, but each party's views were strongly felt and much repeated. The greatest ideological divide came from views of governmental responsibility. Democrats stressed their interest in a restricted role for the federal government at that time, while Whigs called for a strong central government. That's way oversimplifying it. But the panic of 1837 and consequent economic recession helped spur the Whig Party back into gains in the House. Van Buren's Democratic Party had lost popularity, and the Whig policies of economic nationalism appealed to a larger number of voters. Democrats were able, however, to contain the political fallout by blaming the banks for the crisis, and thus were able to cling to their microscopic 1-vote advantage in the House prior to the congressional election of 1838. So that sort of sets the stage. So New Jersey goes out and votes. What widely became known as the Broad Seal War was the result of the hotly contested election between those Whig and Democratic parties for the 6 New Jersey seats in the US House of Representatives. Again, prior to the election of 1838, all 6 incumbents in New Jersey were Whigs. And that's important to note. And the governor of New Jersey, Governor William Pennington, was also a Whig. The congressional election took place on October 9th and 10th, before New Jersey was organized into these congressional districts. That happened, by the way, in 1846, partially as a result of this. Thus, all the seats were chosen at large by voters from the entire state. Congressional districts and candidates elected to represent those districts and voted upon by only the citizens residing in those districts, again, were established in 1846. The governor, William Pennington, and his Privy Council were in charge of the election. That also changed pretty much as a result of this later on, when the Secretary of State's office, like it has in many other states, took over the election. And again, this might have been one of the precipitating things that happened to cause that. So the governor and the Privy Council have the obligation of totaling the votes received from all the county clerks, and they issue certificates stamped with the broad seal of the state to the victors. And that's where the name Broad Seal War came, because the governor is putting his broad seal stamp on a certificate and handing it to the winner, who then goes to Washington, hands the certificate to the clerk of the House of Representatives, and gets sworn in. At least that's the way it's supposed to work. After doing so, the Whig governor and the Whig-dominated council announced that all 6 incumbent Whig Democrats, John Akrigg, Joseph Fitzrandolph, William Halstead, John Maxwell, Charles Stratton, and Thomas York, were re-elected by an extremely narrow margin. So New Jersey is just as divided as the rest of the country is. However, only Joseph Fitz Randolph collected significantly more votes than his Democratic opponents, William Cooper, Philemon Dickinson, Manning Force, Joseph Killey, Daniel Rial, and Peter Vroom. So it looks like the Whigs have won by a very narrow margin, except for one Democrat. However, upon closer examination, the controversy breaks out when it was discovered that the votes from Millville Township in Cumberland County and South Amboy Township in Middlesex County were not counted at all. They weren't included with the returns from the Cumberland and the Middlesex County clerks. The Cumberland County clerk, Joseph Fithian, a Whig, claimed that the Millville returns lacked the seal of the township clerk, a Whig, and moreover, they appeared to have been opened before they came to him. So he decided on his own to just not count them at all. The Middlesex County clerk, Nicholson Buriam, also cited several irregularities, and he claimed that they invalidated the entire South Amboy returns, even though there was a 252 Democratic majority of the votes tabulated. Also, the Millville County clerk said that the ballots got to him, the clerks from the township of Millville got there a few hours late. If the Millville and South Amboy votes had been counted, 5 of the 6 Whig candidates would have been elected, would have been defeated, the ones that were claimed to have elected. Despite this, all 6 Whigs received the commissions of election on November 1st, 1838, for terms to begin right away, to which were affixed the official broad seal of New Jersey and signed by Governor Pennington. So now we fast forward to 1839, and the U.S. House of Representatives meets to organize. When the clerk of the House reached to New Jersey in the roll call, he called only the name of Joseph Fitz Randolph and passed over the names of the other claimants. The Whig commission holders had expected trouble because they knew how they were elected or maybe not elected, but certainly not this soon. A raging 2-week debate followed while the House remained unorganized and without a speaker. The House really didn't have any precedence for this, and they didn't think they could even organize and conduct any business unless all the members were sworn in and present. So when the debate ended, the Democratic majority, not counting the 5 disputed New Jersey seats, the Democrats still held this 119 to 118 edge, voted to leave the 5 contested seats vacant. Thus, New Jersey was left without its legal representation in the House, marking the first time in the country's history that a state was not so represented. The entire matter was then presented to the House Committee on Elections, which consisted of a 5-4 Democratic majority. Notice how close everything is, 119 to 118, 5-4. I mean, the country is really divided in half. The committee began working on the case on January 14th and dealt with the dispute for several months. Meanwhile, the New Jersey legislature and the legislatures of other states passed all sorts of resolutions for and against the House, the actions of the House of Representatives, mainly claiming that the House had no legal authority to conduct business without full representation from the state of New Jersey, the only state not represented. In March of 1840, so much time is going by and New Jersey is just not there when the House is voting on things. In March of 1840, the preliminary report and resolution of the House Committee on Elections is sent up, and they obviously resolved to seat the 5 Democratic candidates, the 5 Democratic claimants, I should say, were accepted by the House. After this was accomplished, the committee continued its work because the House wanted more documentation. And after interviewing hundreds of voters and investigating allegations of vote fraud, the Whigs claimed that illegal votes were being cast by aliens for the Democratic candidates. The Democrats made similar accusations, very few of which were actually backed up. It was mostly hearsay, people saying, oh, my neighbor voted and shouldn't have voted, and that kind of stuff. So it was finally resolved after the final report finally comes out on July 8th of 1840. and they resolved that 5 of the 6 Democrats be seated. The House votes, and by a very narrow vote, the Democrats are seated, with the exception of Manning Force, who clearly received fewer votes than Joseph Fitzrandolph. So the Democrats now come in and take 5/6 of the New Jersey delegation. The House concurs and thus closes the door on one of the most bitterly contested elections in the young nation's history. The committee heard testimony regarding not only South Amboy and Millville, but numerous other New Jersey cities. The incumbent New Jersey Whigs claimed that there were more numerous acts of fraud in favor of the Democratic candidates. An example from Vernon and Sussex County: persons attempting to challenge illegal voters were deterred by insults and threats, and their challenges wholly disregarded. And the poll list of said township was destroyed immediately or as soon after said election, which prevented in a great measure the investigation of said frauds. So you have these allegations of fraud and votes being thrown away and people being insulted and challenged and kept away from the polls. Sounds a little familiar. Interestingly, the minority report determining that the Whig candidates who held the commissions of election from the governor should be seated was written by none other than Millard Fillmore, who as a congressman and member of the Committee on Elections favored Governor Pennington's actions. And as we know, Fillmore later becomes president, and Pennington takes advantage of that. Ultimately, numerous examples were given of people voting illegally on both sides of the political aisle, and neither party appearing to be greatly more honest than the other. However, it was made clear that on the flimsiest of excuses, that the votes of Millville and South Amboy were delivered a few hours after the clerk's deadlines, but days before the clerks were required to turn them into the governor and privy council, the county clerks of Cumberland and Middlesex deliberately withheld votes that would have given the Democrats the victory, and the governor and council deliberately chose to not question the tallies. For Governor Pennington, the Broad Seal War was likely the highlight, or you might want to call it the lowlight, of his administration. However, his association with that scandal didn't negatively affect his political status. President Millard Fillmore, when he becomes president, nominates Pennington to be the territorial governor of Minnesota. He also nominates him to be a claims judge under the treaty that ended the Mexican War. However, Pennington turned those down in order to run to Congress, this time as a Republican. So his association with the U.S. House of Representatives didn't seem to end with his gubernatorial administration. New Jersey began electing its congressional delegation by district, as I mentioned before. And now, as a member of the Republican Party, in 1858, Pennington is elected to the House to represent New Jersey's 5th congressional district. Incredibly, as a freshman congressman, he's not just any old congressman, but he runs to be Speaker of the House. And after 44 ballots, and still a very contentious House, after 44 ballots, he is actually elected as Speaker. And so if heaven forbid a similar act of fraud would not affect the entire congressional delegation, but only a single candidate. So here is now Pennington as a congressman. He is only in the limelight for those 2 years because not only is he does not retain his speaker status, but he is also not elected for re-election. He loses his election bid. So that ends this whole saga. And it's interesting to see the way the sources that we have about this treat all of this. The report that I mentioned that Congress put out was almost 300 pages in length. It's just incredible how much time was spent on this. Congress was in a real panic because they really didn't know what to do given the fact that they were not fully represented. And of course, the state of New Jersey is not represented at all in any way. So again, little has been written about this less than glamorous chapter in New Jersey's political history, but it's extremely well documented with sources created as the drama was unfolding. There were literally dozens of speeches by members of the House of Representatives and the legislatures of New Jersey and other states as well. These debates and the extensive reports of the committees investigating the election were published in the Congressional Globe, which is now called the Congressional Record, and the final report of the Committee of Elections, which I mentioned was nearly 300 pages long. And fortunately, the Congressional Globe and all the reports of many of the committees are now available on the internet, thanks to HathiTrust and Google Books and all of that. So I was able to look at this again when I first began studying this interesting chapter in our history. None of this stuff was digitized. So in addition to frequent newspaper coverage, the best contemporary coverage of this event was published in the United States Magazine and Democratic Review, just as this was going on. It was in their July 4th, 1838, their Independence Day issue. And they talk about just how horrible an occasion this was. They compare Governor Pennington and the Privy Council to Benedict Arnold, and but they come out with a lot of optimism for the future. They think this was so bad that it could never happen again. And as we all know, that didn't quite happen. But let me read just a little bit of this, what came out in this magazine in 1839. They say, the last year has witnessed events which are destined to an enduring but dark celebrity in our annals as a free people. When the tempests of partisan strife shall have subsided, when sober reason and cool reflection retain their wonted ascendancy over the minds of men, when the struggle for political power shall have passed with those who originated and who hope to profit by it, and those events are viewed through the medium of the intervening years, men will gaze with astonishment upon spectacle of folly and wickedness which they present, and the historian will chronicle them among the sad records of human infirmity, where faction, the purpose of the hour, has so often assumed the tremendous responsibility of defeating the fairest experiments of human liberty. The actors in each successive scene may have their future apologists. Arnold and Burr have theirs. But while the fires of liberty shall continue to burn bright on our political altars and in the hearts of the people, they will not be forgotten or forgiven. The conspirators sought the perpetuation of their power. They made their returning officers the instruments for suppressing the vote, the voice of the people, and reversing the decisions of the ballot boxes. So you see, they come off it as angry as they are. They feel that this is a tremendous lesson for history, that historians will write about this and it will never happen again. So as we know, things like this unfortunately did happen again, maybe not quite the same way, but threatening and challenging and just basically throwing allegations at one another. And certainly now at the highest level here in the United States, with our president doing this and his supporters doing this, maybe that lesson hasn't been learned too well. And one can only hope that given the fractures that took place in this election that are currently taking place, will then inform people in the future. And maybe, even though we didn't heed the lessons of 1838, maybe we will heed the lessons of 2020. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ron, and perfect timing. I didn't even have to give my 2-minute warning, so thank you so much. At this point, the people we have in the audience are welcome to ask questions in the chat, or if you'd like to, I don't know, do we have ability to raise hands in here? I'm not really sure, but in any case, it might be easier to type your question in the chat. But if you would like to also, kind of show yourself now so we can all sort of see each other. And again, I just want to thank everybody for their earlier patience when Ron was working out his technical glitches. And thank you to Michele and Phillip for being kind of willing to kind of do the quick switcheroo so that we could have time to get it all worked out. So there is a question that's come up in the chat that I'll start with, and then we can go on to others. So this one is from Gary Sretzi, who says, as Ron indicated, the 1838 election debacle led to reform. Will the 2020 election lead to any significant change in the election process? And so I don't know if, Ron, if you want to say anything about that. And I think I saw.
Well, I think we're in the same position as the writer was in the U.S. magazine back in 1839, as he discusses this. But one of the reasons that we study history is so that we can learn from it. And clearly, I think the country is so fractured now that hopefully there will be a lesson that will be learned. It's really hard to say, and the coming days will certainly show that, to see if we can come together and heal under the new administration. We can only hope, but we have to report things as they happen. We have to report history. We have to remind people of what has happened and what could happen and what the dangers are for messing with really one of our most important rights, the right to vote, what this conference is all about and what democracy is all about.
I see that Gail Mamgreen has their hand up, and then Adam Sherry. So we'll start with Gail and then Adam.
I hope you can hear me. I have two questions. One for Phillip. I just want to know how he learned about those comments that Patton made to the officers when they were standing around having coffee. And to Ron, I'm wondering about the bigger consequence of the Democratic victory in Congress at that time. We know that as history unfolded, the Whigs turned out to be, at least to some extent, the good guys in issues of slavery, support for the Confederacy. It had a big impact, not only on the color of New Jersey politics, but national politics. So it seems that given that Congress was so closely split at the time, the victory of the Democrats might have had some real policy reverberations also.
Thank you.
Thank you for that question. Those comments come from Lucian Truscott, who was a cavalry officer, a lieutenant, who was among those officers who were there with Patton, sipping coffee when Angelo shows up there. The sergeant shows up with Angelo, and he documents this in some of his writings.
Great. And then Ron, do you want to?
Okay, so in terms of what the significance really was and the reforms that came about, certainly New Jersey came up with some reforms in that the Secretary of State ran the election afterwards. Now, of course, it doesn't mean that the Secretary of State can't be tainted as much as the governor and the council can be tainted. But that reform happened shortly afterwards. Also, the establishment of congressional districts happened shortly afterwards. In terms of the country, yes, the Democrats do maintain control, and we know we go barreling towards the Civil War from this point under Democratic control. It wasn't really 100%, even though there was a lot of polarization. There are Whigs who are in favor of slavery, including Governor Pennington. And although Pennington does become a Republican later on, but I think it does have an effect. The Whigs were basically the good guys for the most part at that time. They really were they were called Federalists and were much more in tune with the federal government than the Democrats were at the time. So it probably did make a big difference. But the rancor was just, it reminded me so much of what's going on today in Congress and in our country, even in local elections. Things are just so evenly divided. And I'm living in a state right now which is just crazy in this effect, and that there are more Democratic registrants in Florida than there are Republicans. And yet Republicans seem to win all of the statewide seats partially because of gerrymandering and partially because of voter suppression. Here in Florida, we passed a resolution 4, just 2 years ago, which would have enabled all people who have served, criminals who have served their sentences, to vote. And the legislature and governor, who are Republicans, completely decided that all fines had to be paid as well. And since almost none of them can pay these fines, didn't even know how much they owed, very few of them were able to vote. So this is really a continuing theme.
Thank you. So Adam, and then I see a question in the chat, and if anyone else has questions in the chat.
Could I follow up on Gail's question?
Sure,
Also, the newspapers picked up on the story. A day later, the New York Times on its front page had a story about the cavalry commander who basically shunned the man who saved his life, and then that story ran in that nationwide. And I found stories about it like in Brownsville, Texas newspapers. You know, these small little town newspapers ran that story.
Interesting. Okay. Adam?
Yes, this question is for all of the panelists. Do you see any direct parallels between the 1828 U.S. House election in New Jersey and the Florida theater of the 2000 presidential election?
Well, in some ways, yes, in some ways, no. I think I pointed out some of the similarities of voter suppression here. But in terms of the way the election actually happened in Florida, Florida is one of the states where mail voting is very, very easy to do, and it has been for quite a while, probably longer than most other states, mostly because of the debacle in the 2000 election, which some of you I'm sure remember was decided by Florida and probably decided incorrectly. Thousands of ballots were thrown out because the folding chads were not folded the right way and what have you, and it held up things for a very, very long time. Although fortunately, one of the sides did back down and we didn't have a constitutional crisis. So in that way, Florida is sort of ahead of the game. But in terms of the gerrymandering that goes on here, the way the Republicans are able to stay in power in a state that has many more Democratic registrants than Republicans is something that really needs to be cured and something that hasn't been fixed since those days. I hope that New Jersey's elections are going a lot better now. I didn't participate in this one, but it certainly did lead, as I mentioned before, the debacle of 1838 did lead to some reform, at least. Reform that would have happened anyway, because all states have congressional districts right now, and almost every state has the Secretary of State monitoring the election. But it probably was hastened a little bit by this.
Thank you. Thank you, Ron.
Thank you.
So, oh, sorry. There's a question in the chat from Fernando. So good to see you. And this is for Michele and Phillip. She's interested in what inspired you to research the story of Mr. Angelo. I'll
take this one if you don't mind, Phil. First, let me explain that prior to the pandemic, Phil and I shared an office. So that's sort of where this came about. And Phil's been working on a history of World War I told through the experiences of Staten Island residents. And he actually first came across the story of Joseph Angelo in the Bonus Army, which obviously fell outside Staten Island. I've been working on Italian Americans in New Jersey, and he had the Italian background, so he mentioned it to me. And we started looking them up and just, found that there was a lot there, that it was really interesting in terms of, both looking at sort of, his heroism of World War I, but then how he kind of became a celebrity again in the Bonus Army and the ties there. And it's really been, interesting working together because, Phil's really much more of an expert on the military stuff. So, he'll write up pages of, tank stuff. And I'm like, wow, that's a lot. And then I tend to get sidetracked by the sort of social history stuff. Angelo was really, a character. There was, one point I'll just share a story because it didn't really fit in. I find it interesting. In 1931, not long after he testified, maybe a month or two, there was a story in the paper about how a taxi driver was arrested for a theft. His wife was then, shadowed to see where she would go. And she went to Joseph Angelo's house and supposedly asked him to help her, get some drugs that they had hidden. And apparently he went to the police and claimed he had nothing to do with it. But there's all sorts of really interesting stories there as well. So we kind of really, I think, complement each other nicely with the kind of information that we focused on.
Thank you.
I also found his connection to Patton and you know, saving Patton's life, and then how Patton sort of becomes, you know, the sort of military hero, one of the military heroes of World War II, and you know, the sort of, you know, how here's this guy who saved his life and sort of begins to fade out for a little while from history, and then of course comes back during the bonus army. He's down and out on his luck, and Patton is, you know, pardon my pun, he's riding to glory in it will be World War II. So I found sort of the sort of irony there and the dichotomy very interesting.
Interesting. Are there other questions? Anyone? I have one, but I want to make sure that everybody else. So maybe while you're thinking about it or thinking about something to write in the chat, I'll just ask this to all the panelists, especially, you know, I'm thinking about source materials with Ron on the panel, given how vital the special collections at Rutgers was for my own research. So I just would love to hear from all of you, what was sort of the most rewarding research find that you have found so far in your work on these projects, that sort of archival or digital now nugget that really has added, you know, a wonderful aspect to your research to date?
Well, I seem to be coming up with new sources every day. It's amazing how well this was documented by the federal government. They really left no stone unturned. Every single meeting of that committee on elections over a long period of time is now available. And like I said, it's almost 300 pages. A lot of it is unbelievably boring. They take down every single word, like where people sat, and they repeat things over and over and over, but it is very detailed in terms of the various allegations that were made. Some could be sort of proven, some not. And then there are again, the newspapers were quite political at the time, as some of them are now as well. But more people, there were more newspapers at the time, certainly. And now that we talked about the digital project over the lunch hour to make more and more of these papers available. And so there are opinion pieces there. But everybody seemed to want to say something about it. Certainly in Congress, in the various states, you'll find the proceedings of the state legislatures in other states talking about this. And so there is quite a bit. In fact, I came upon a source just the other day, believe it or not, which of course I can't get access to because I can't get in the building. I happened to be going through the Richard P. McCormick papers. As many of you remember, Richard P. McCormick was really the dean of New Jersey historians. And he wrote a book on voting in New Jersey. And to this day, it's really the most comprehensive one up until that time. He wrote it in 1953. But I looked over the finding aid for his papers. There's a very detailed finding aid for his papers, which are at Rutgers. And sure enough, one of his students in 1948 wrote a paper on he called it the Great Seal War in New Jersey. And so I can't wait to see it, but of course it's going to be a while before we can get access to it. But as soon as we can, I'll be looking forward to seeing that as well and seeing what kind of sources that person saw back in 1948. But there are many sources, and some of it reads almost like a drama, and some of it is as boring as it can be, but it is pretty well documented.
Right. How about you guys, Michele or Phillip? Any sort of great research finds you want to highlight?
I just found the extensive coverage in the newspapers of the bonus of Angelo. You know, there was coverage of him, like I said, in Brownsville, Texas. You know, I found that very interesting. You know, just the amount of detail in some of the articles about him outside of this area. Outside of Camden, his local newspapers, just extraordinary to me.
Right, thanks.
And it is, I mean, you know, given the last few months, almost a year, I guess, you know, it's been difficult to go places to do research, and it is astonishing, you know, what's available. You know, I actually enjoyed the Congressional Record, which really, you know, you had so much of, you know, Angelo's words himself, you know, testifying and really making his case before, you know, these committees. So I found that really interesting. And, you know, the Zillow find of the house, you know, really excited me as well to be able to see his house, even though it's today. So it's really, you know, between the newspapers, congressional record, things like that, there's really just all different kinds of sources, I think, that we used.
Yeah, that's great. And I think what I like so much about both of these papers is they are really kind of helping to highlight what, and here's my shameless plug for the new Rutgers University Press series, is what we're hoping to do is sort of really highlight how New Jersey stories have national prominence, right? That really go beyond our state borders and affect things on a much broader level. And, you know, I think seeing how, like, you know, in Ron's case, how this, what could be just a sort of local New Jersey kind of, you know, the joke about corrupt politics kind of thing, really, you know, really does have, you know, significant impact on national political stage, right? And kind of highlighting those connections, I think, is really important to the, you know, the future direction of New Jersey studies. So I encourage all of you to consider your research and, you know, consider.
You know, there's that statement, of course, that all history is local. So who would have thought that the lowly clerks of Cumberland County and Middlesex County could have started something that would have had such significance for the whole country?
Absolutely. But I think that's the New Jersey story, right? So, so yeah, we do have a couple minutes left, but I just want to say, you know, if people are starting to wrap up, that, you know, there is one final session today, right? I know it's been a long day. You might have some Zoom fatigue, but I think this last, you know, post-election breakout session at the end, you know, I'm sure that for many of us, the 2020 election is, you know, kind of fresh on everybody's mind, and there's so many issues that it has raised and so much controversy. So, you know, I think getting to do a little bit of post-election analysis with this great community of scholars is really fabulous. So if you've got like another half an hour in you, I really encourage you to attend that last session. I think it'll be really interesting. And, you know, clearly, you know, given even the questions that came out about Ron's research, of, you know, and its current, you know, the way it reflects upon the current political thing, this is clearly something that is of great interest to this historical community. In general, I just want to, on behalf of the New Jersey Historical Commission, to thank all of you for attending this virtual conference. I think, you know, little technical glitches here and there, notwithstanding, it's been a really successful format to have it virtually. And, you know, I really have enjoyed the day, and I've really, you know, thank everybody for their participation. And as I said, we do have time for one more question if anyone has one, but if not, hopefully I will see everybody at that post-election final session. Is there a kitty cat now there too? Yay. So yay. So now my Zoom day is made, so thank you.
Hi, I just had one small question, and that was whether it was the case that Patton helped D'Angelo financially, as he suggested, after the war. Did he substantially help him in any way?
I know he gave him a couple of payments after the war, and in 1939 he gave him a $25 payment. So he did help him out, you know, a couple of times.
Not impressed.
He did sell the chain from the gold watch that he got, also, he said.
The chain from the gold watch, right?
Yes, just the chain. He kept the watch, but the chain he said he sold.
So when I see a dog has entered the fray, now you can't have, you know, there's like a cat dog show down here happening, which is fabulous. So, wonderful. It's one of my favorite parts about Zoom is getting to see people's pets. So thank you. Yes, I see. I'm trying to see. It's
Yeah, can I raise a question of the, can you hear me?
Yes, yeah, please go on.
Okay. I enjoyed the Angelo account very much, and I'm intrigued about what's significant of it. Was it typical? Were there more episodes like this? Is what happened to him that unusual in this time frame? Why is this worth focusing on?
Well, I'll start. Phil, you can add, I guess. I don't think it was unusual. I mean, I think, you know, Angelo did have a bit of extra celebrity that a lot of the other soldiers didn't necessarily have. But, you know, in terms of his economic circumstances, joining the bonus march, that was all very typical. Phil and I have been trying to think about, you know, exactly what it meant, though, because there was something to the idea that the protest was legitimate because these men had been soldiers and had been patriots. And, you know, to be fair, we're still kind of working through this question. You know, we were thinking it's a little bit like how the idea of, you know, the deserving poor, that, you know, people who protest in a way, you know, it's American, but in another way, it's, you know, needs to be that your needs are sort of, you know, legitimated. And there are many times that, you know, Angelo would, you know, use the line like, you know, there's a DSC man, you know, out here protesting. There's a DSC man who's forced to do this, you know, the same way that, you know, like Patman, who defended him, said that this is an honest debt. It's not a handout. And so we're trying to work through what the protest meant more broadly as we think about, you know, protest in America. If you want to add, Phil.
I mean, I think you summed it up pretty well. I mean, I think it's also a matter of, you know, we served this country. When the country wanted us to go, we went. And, you know, now we're being treated as if, you know, we're just like, you know, nobodies. And so, you know, I think there's a sense of legitimizing protest through military service. You know, in the 1960s and 70s, where he's sort of condemning the student protests. I think in part he's condemning it because it's like, look, you know, I protested, but I served. You're not serving, so you know, I have more of a say in what's patriotic and what can be protested over than you do. I think there's some of that going on in those comments later on in his life. You know, there's also the sense of protest in a democracy. You know, I think some of these guys felt like we went over there to fight for democracy against totalitarianism in World War I, and you know, this is our right in a democracy to protest for what we think our service is owed to us by our government for our service.
Thank you. So that is the end of our time together. So I just want to again thank our presenters, Ron and Michele and Phil, and also the entire New Jersey Historical Commission community for this wonderful conference. And as I said, hope to see you in the final day's event. And I hope you all had a wonderful, inspiring conference. And thank you all for joining us this afternoon.
Yeah, I will. Just